Hey guys, welcome or welcome back. Tisha here, back for another chapter reading of The Sound of Gravel. Go ahead and do me a favor and hit the like button as we begin this chapter. I'm going to apologize in advance for any yuckiness that may occur on camera. I'm fighting my allergies and they're winning. So I have my tissue and all that other stuff over here. Hopefully I don't have to solicit my son to do the one thing that I don't like to do, which is edit. And we can get through this without me having a coughing fit, okay? Go ahead and like the video. That's good. And let's begin. Chapter 39. She has a picture here of Alex, Micah, and Junior. I hope you guys can see it. The funeral was scheduled for the next afternoon. I passed a long, fitful night in an oversized wooden rocking chair with Holly, trying to train her to accept her first rubble nipple. Oh yeah, she was breastfed. So that's really, really difficult when you're presenting a foreign object like that to her when she's accustomed to her mother's scent, as well as it's now a completely different texture. Earlier that evening, Lane's sister Lisa and I had driven from house to house in the colony, desperately searching for a woman who might be able to nurse Holly. Even when we found someone willing to help, Holly refused to latch on and suckle. She kicked her chubby legs at every nursing mother we presented, clenching her fists and screaming each time one of them tried to feed her. Poor baby. Because she doesn't even understand what's going on. They're just trying to make sure she's fed, and she's so unaccustomed to having someone else other than her mother that she just doesn't want it. And I don't blame her. I won't want it either. I want my mom. She would cry uncontrollably until put back in my arms. I was the only one who could calm her. Every time I offered her the rubber nipple, Holly jerked her tiny head back and forth, stubbornly resisting it. My hands began to shake when I thought about how helpless I was. I couldn't help my mom when she was laying at my feet, and I couldn't help my sister even when she hadn't eaten in hours. But just as I was at the point of giving up, a tiny drop of liquid dripped onto Holly's tongue. Either she no longer found the taste of formula offensive, or she was just too hungry to care. Soon, she was sucking with abandon, closing her eyes and relaxing her body. Oh, wow. I sighed as my sister's warmth began to flow into my arms. It was as if she were melting into me. Lisa came into the living room and congratulated me on my achievement. I thanked her for her help, carried Holly to bed in a back room, and lay beside her, my mind replaying every detail of the day. Micah's and Mom's death might not have happened if I'd prevented any one of the dozens of bad coincidences that occur within seconds of each other. This is what we do. We blame ourselves for things when we lose loved ones tragically. And of course, it's real easy to say it's not your fault, but in that moment and even after, you still don't feel that way. If I had been able to stop Mom, to say the exact right things to keep her from touching the fence, or if I'd been watching the boys play, if even one small detail had played out differently, their lives would have been spared. Why couldn't I have saved them? Why had electricity been running through that fence? Holly's stomach gurgled, and she soon woke up and started to cry. I put her on my shoulder to burp her and almost immediately felt her little body convulse and vomit chalky white formula all over my nightshirt. I hardly reacted. So minor did this seem in the grand scheme of things. I calmly cleaned us both up, fed her another bottle, and watched her fall asleep again, by which time roosters were crowing outside and a cool blue glow began to wash over the room. As the sun rose, its harsh light piercing my eyes like tiny shards of glass, I handed Holly off to Lisa and left the house in search of Mom and Micah, whose bodies were being prepared for burial in another nearby house. Just as with Mary, there was no money to pay for a proper embalming, so the burials would need to happen quickly. As I walked to the makeshift morgue, feeling the July sun burn into the dry Mexican earth with every step, I had a sick feeling about what I would find. It is so hard when you lose a loved one as is, then to have witnessed it in the manner that she did, then to not even really be given time to process it because they don't have the funds to preserve her mother's body or her sibling's body. That's a lot. Still, I had to be certain that they were being given the best possible care, that whoever had dressed Mom had put her in the outfit I'd picked out for her, that they curled her hair as I had requested, that they used the right kind of makeup. I opened a wooden screen door directly into a square living room. It was dark and empty except for the 3 bodies lying on long portable tables. Mom, Micah, and Junior were all dressed in burial clothes. Box fans whirled in each corner of the room, circulating warm, damp air that only seemed to speed up the decomposition. Oh my goodness. I didn't even think about the fact that they're in this hot room. Oh my goodness. The breeze made the pleats in the boys' dark slacks tremble, and I noticed that they'd been dressed identically in stiff white shirts and navy blue ties. Micah's and Junior's hands had been placed at their sides and their hair slicked back like 2 proper Mormon boys. Micah's face was still freckled and sunburned, and a straight black line ran across each of his palms where they made contact with the fence. His fingers looked as if they'd been burned from the inside out. I was more hesitant to approach Mom, whose body was laid out on the opposite side of the room. Even from a distance, I saw that the burial preparations hadn't gone well. She wasn't in the dress I had picked out. Instead, she wore white, a color Mom never wore. A woman I barely knew walked into the room, approached me, and explained that my mother's body had been too swollen to wear the dress I'd chosen. She needed a larger size in death than she wore in life. The closer I moved to Mom's body, the more confused I felt. Her hair was combed and curled convincingly, parted down the middle and feathered back, but otherwise she barely looked like herself. Her face was caked with too much foundation. Her swollen straight lips were overpainted with pearl pink lipstick and her eyelashes too thickly coated with brown mascara. She was no longer wearing her ever-present, ever-slipping eyeglasses. Someone had found and retrieved them from the spot where they'd fallen, but like the dress, her glasses were too small for her swollen face. On the plus side, her palms hadn't been burned during the brief time they made contact with the fence. Her fingers looked just as they had before, just like mine, short and chubby with fingernails chewed to the quick. Mom had always told me that I resembled the LeBaron side of the family, but examining her bare legs and feet under her ruffled dress, I saw clearly that I wasn't just my father's daughter. Our calves were the same shape. So were our feet and toes. The rest of the morning, I busied myself with dressing my sisters for the funeral, as well as preparing a diaper bag with a clean outfit for Holly, diapers, bottles, and formula to make it through the afternoon. People from our town began to arrive, but for the most part, I didn't have the energy to greet them. Finally, I looked out the window and saw a fragile figure walking down the road toward the house where we were staying, my grandmother. I ran out to meet her. She made her way awkwardly, her head down, watching the road and stepping around potholes. The surprise and joy of seeing her, not to mention the man who'd driven her down from the airport in El Paso, Matt, brought fresh tears to my eyes. Trailing Grandma, my brother looked exhausted by the trip. He rubbed bloodshot, swollen eyes as I ran and threw my arms around him and around Grandma, as if they were the last links between me and the life I'd once known. I should have been there, Matt said, sobbing and embracing me, his entire body shaking. I'm so sorry. I should have helped with Mom. I should have protected her, protected Micah. What are we going to do without them? I don't know. I was incapable of any words of consolation. I don't know what we're going to do. All the while, Grandma just stood there, her head lowered, crying yet speechless. It was the first time I'd seen her without Grandpa, and the first time she'd been to the colony in over a decade. That's the thing about death, it's so final. And here her grandmother is, having lost her husband, and now she's also lost her daughter. We walked inside the house, and for a while, the three of us found ourselves in a square living room in a round house surrounded by cement walls with rounded corners, trapped in an uncomfortable, heavy silence. Grandma kept her head bowed and her shoulders hunched forward in a navy blue polyester suit that looked too big on her. She had become so thin and frail. I watched her raise her solemn, stunned face to adjust her wire-frame glasses and massage her temples. Finally, she looked at Matt and said, at Matt and me and said, well, I guess we'll talk more about the younger kids after the funeral. Yeah, we should probably get going. Matt wiped his swollen eyes. Are they all ready to go, Ruthie? I nodded. They're in the backyard. I'll get them in the diaper bag. It was afternoon, and the heat was intense by the time we'd all walked a few blocks to the public viewing of the bodies. Grandma moved slowly and unsteadily down the dirt road, but also scornfully, as if each potful confirmed her assessment of LeBaron as a mistake, a place far too harsh for her daughter and grandchildren to live. I walked with Holly on my hip and Elena and Leah at my side, both in their wrinkled Sunday dresses, both staring wide-eyed at all the strangers. Next came Luke and Aaron and Matt, each wearing his own version of a lost look. All of us, a caravan of wounded souls, were drenched in sweat by the time we reached the house. On the other side of the screen door was a living room full of people gathered around the bodies, which had now all been placed in white wooden coffins. Mostly the crowd was quiet, except for Alejandra, whom I'd already heard crying from a distance. She sobbed, "Mijo, mijo," endlessly as we stepped over the threshold and into the room. Our noses suddenly overwhelmed by a smell so putrid, a stench so overwhelming I almost fainted. Just as I feared, the bodies were decomposing rapidly. I felt myself retch uncomfortably. Oh boy. Through the fog, I watched Junior's grandmother hold the boy's head to her bosom and repeatedly kiss his forehead as she stood over his coffin. Maria was crying on the other side of the room, and Matt went to her, sobbing again as he wrapped his arms around her. My one wish had been to see my mother and brother one last time, although I regretted it as soon as I laid eyes on Mom's casket. Over the hours, her head had taken on the cast of a wax figure, one that was melting into her white satin beading. Her mascara was bleeding. Oh, see? It's so much that goes on with this, and it's just sad because of the conditions. I don't want to personally remember my loved one like that. I remember my grandmother looked good, right? She looked really, really good, but it still wasn't my grandma to me. Like, you want to remember them a certain way. And for me, there's times where I've regretted looking at certain people. Like with my brother, I refused. I did not look at him. I didn't want to remember him like that. I didn't want to see him like that. My son did, and seeing his reaction to it, I knew I didn't need to look at him. So I'm hearing this, and in those instances that I just told you, they were embalmed. They had makeup artists and all those other things that were professionally done. So to hear this situation where this girl is already traumatized by everything else, and now she's sitting there having to see her mother as things aren't going right. They should have closed those caskets at some point. I don't know. The body before me didn't look at all familiar, and I had to look away. I wasn't sure I wanted to see Micah, but I brought along something that I wanted him to have. My most treasured stuffed animal, a rainbow bright Care Bear. Just as it had once done for me, I hoped the bear would help Micah get used to the dark. As I made my way to the little coffin, I saw that his arms had sprung up and had returned to the position they'd been in on the fence. And from the distance, he looked as if he were climbing out of the coffin. His arms reached towards heaven. I forced myself forward. His head was arched back too, as it had been on the fence. I placed the bear on his chest and quickly walked away. My nose burned from the stench, and the crowd of people made me so claustrophobic. I began to have trouble breathing. But just as I felt I would pass out, I heard my grandmother's voice behind me. "Would someone please close the coffins?" she said weakly, shaking her head and turning toward the door. "Do the kids need to see the bodies disintegrating?" Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Close them. Don't add this level of hurt to them. My siblings and I quickly followed her outside, and together we walked the short distance to the church. We took the rickety black bench up front, with Leah and Elena on either side of me and Holly on my lap with the bottle that she was thankfully suckling. Lane sat on the bench behind us. I was furious with him. He had been responsible for the electric wiring on the farm. He was complicit in Mom's, Micah's, and Junior's deaths. I vowed not to look at him that day, or indeed ever again. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that he was strangely expressionless as he closed the coffins. As the coffins closed, were carried into the church and placed on the cement floor in front of us, directly under the pulpit. The large photo of my father brooded heavily over the three caskets. As the service began, everyone stood for a prayer that was given first in English and then in Spanish. Still standing, the mourners took out hymnals and sang songs in both languages, songs about going home to our Father in heaven. Everyone but me. I couldn't hold both Holly and a hymnal, and I didn't have enough strength to sing along. When we finally sat back down, eulogists spoke about Micah and Junior, some in Spanish, some in English. Then one of Lane's many sisters came up to the pulpit to tell Mom's story, saying that she had lived her life by example, that she continued to bring God's souls onto this earth, despite difficult pregnancies and the burden of disabled children, that she continued to bring souls into the earth and harm herself and harm her kids and not properly feed them and have them suffer and live in poverty and all these other things. They sit here and they promote this stuff as if it's worth applauding, but really is it, when you think about how these children are forced to live and what it does to these women and their bodies and what it does to these kids and their psyche? Like, I feel like in listening to this book, as well as many others, we've seen that this way of living, the way that they were taught things, seems to have done more harm in a lot of instances than good. Lane's sister reminded us that Mom had been widowed young, but had nevertheless remained faithful to the church's founding principles. As the women concluded her speech, Elena tapped me on the shoulder and whispered that she needed to go to the bathroom. I handed Holly to Matt and led Elena by the hand to the wooden outhouse in front of the church and then for a drink of water from a garden hose. We made our way back to our seats as Alma LeBaron, my father's older brother, stepped up to the pulpit. I had seen him in town, but we had never spoken. Y'all hear that? So her father passed. Her father had many wives and many kids. And one of the connections to her father was her uncle, who she saw, but he never spoke to her. But we're supposed to think that it's great for them to have all of these kids, yet they don't even acknowledge the kids that are on earth. Slender and gray-haired, Alma stood tall with proud shoulders as he launched into a story about the colony's founding, the church at its center, my father the prophet, and the importance of his teachings. So this is what we're going to talk about at a funeral? Okay. I waited and waited for him to move on to an appreciation of the prophet's wife and her contributions and sacrifices. Exactly. Mom had been Alma's sister-in-law, after all, not to mention the young boys who had lost their lives. But his story never evolved. He never mentioned the real reason for our gathering. After enduring 40 minutes of this, Grandma got up and walked outside once more, the sole protester. See, I'm all for her grandmother, because it's bad enough that her daughter was forced or believed in this situation, that her daughter felt like she needed to stay here. And as a result, had she not never left, had she stayed where she was, life probably would have been a lot different for her kids and for her daughter. But here you are, and you're sitting here and you're talking about her daughter, you're talking about her grandkids' mother in terms of she populated the world, but nothing else. My uncle spoke for over an hour before finally exiting the pulpit. And while I sat through the entire speech, I was so shocked by his admissions. I could feel the skin on my face turning red. I whipped around to glare at Lane, breaking my promise to myself. Do something, I pleaded with my eyes. Redeem yourself in some small way by stopping this spectacle and demanding that he recognize my mother. But Lane just stared back at me, as impassive as ever, his arm folded over his big belly, not a single tear having been shed. As much respect in death as he had for her in life, I thought as I turned back around, scanning the congregation with contempt. When the service was finally over, trucks carried the coffins to the graveyard, and Grandma, my siblings, and I rode behind them in a big van. I sat in the back with my sisters while my brothers occupied the gray vinyl bench seat in front of us, along with Lane's sister, Lisa. Why didn't Alma talk about my mom or my brother? I asked her. She looked over her shoulder. Well, he was here to speak at our conferences today, and we had to cancel our meetings for this. He made the funeral about stuff that was going to be at the conference because the conference was canceled because of the funeral. You can't make this up. You can't do it. This is, you know what? Why am I surprised? I took a deep breath and sank heavily into my seat. A long line of vehicles trailed behind us as we slowly made our way toward the graveyard. While waiting for all the mourners to assemble, Matt and I passed the time by looking for Mary's grave, but to no avail. No one had ever marked it. They had that baby suffer. They starved that baby to death. She passes, and then you all don't even take the extra effort to mark her grave. I stared at the mounds of gravel next to the coffins as prayers were said, more songs were sung, and people took pictures of our families next to the caskets. Eventually, the bodies were lowered into the ground just as the sun sank behind the horizon and the heat finally began to break. People lined up to throw handfuls of earth onto the coffins. I stepped forward to do the same. As I did, someone took Holly from my hip. The tears came almost immediately, as did a shaking from deep inside me. It rumbled out of my stomach into the tips of my fingers and toes. I slowly walked towards my mother's grave. I picked up a large handful of gravel and rolled the hot pieces of stone and sand in my hand, thinking about this place, the dry, dusty Mexican countryside, our small, dilapidated home, the dangers buried underground, my family's violent past, and the tragedy that had just faithfully made its power and presence known. Despite it all, Mom had loved this place. But without her, did I belong here? I stared at her coffin. I could have said so many things to her at that moment, but the only words that came to my mind were, I want you to know that I always loved you. Always, Mom. I was transfixed by the idea that she was contained in that white box. I'm not mad anymore, Mom. I looked at the fistful of gravel. I promise you, I will take care of the girls, Mom, I promise. I said the words quietly, but I meant them. Then I opened my hand and released the warm earth and rock. The sound of gravel, empty and hollow, echoing up from the hole as it struck my mother's wooden coffin. Wow. The sound of gravel for this is so many different things. The sound of gravel falling on the coffin, the sound of gravel as people drive down the pothole-filled street and all those other things. Like, there's a lot in this book. She did such a phenomenal job. Chapter 40. At 11 o'clock the next morning, the family met to talk about what should happen next. 4-year-old Elena and 2-year-old Leah sat with their little legs crossed Indian style, parked neatly on the floor of yet another relative's living room. Aaron sat on one end of the couch, biting his fingernails. Luke was beside him, staring off into the distance, his head tilted slightly to one side, sticking out his tongue. Matt and Grandma looked as if they hadn't slept, and the morning heat only added to everyone's discomfort. Lane joined us, which only made the situation more tense. Before we could think about the future, we yearned for some kind of explanation. We were all wondering, how did this happen? What was Lane thinking when he wired that fence? His pose, dark tan arms folded over his paunch, his legs in a wide stance, made it clear he had anticipated our questions. Now, I had a reason for burying those electrical wires, he began, completely unprompted, as if continuing a discussion he'd been having in his head. I had to take electricity to Alejandra's house. He rested his arm against a wooden pillar as he tried to gauge who might be receptive of this explanation. His disposition completely casual. I pulled wires through this black plastic tubing about an inch in diameter. He made an okay sign with his thumb and forefinger to show us about the approximate size of the tube. I knew the tubing would keep the wires covered, but for protection, I buried the tubing. I buried it along the fence. I looked over at Matt, who was rolling his eyes in frustration. The first piece of wire wasn't long enough to reach all the way from one house to the other, so I cut the tubing and put another piece of wire through that and attached the wires with electrical tape and the tubes with electrical tape too. The quality of his craftsmanship might have been suspect, but the voice in which he spoke of it was confident and almost arrogant. But when we had that thunderstorm the other night, the rain washed away the dirt from the wire and the electrical tape too. Micah's foot just came in contact with that end of the wire. Matt leaned forward on the sofa, squinted at his stepfather, and said with a short, condescending laugh, "Doesn't it seem like you should have maybe buried the wires deeper?" "No," Lane shrugged. "Oh, wow. It was just a freaky thing. The way it happened, that's all." He leaned back against the pillar. Lane could sit there and shed all those tears for himself when he got caught. He can shed tears when he supposedly called Irene to let her know about what happened to his kids. But here you are in front of these kids explaining what you think happened, that unalived their mother and unalived your children, and you're this nonchalant about it. Lane is a jerk. Lane didn't care about anyone but himself, and I'm not buying it. I don't think he ever felt sorry for what happened based on the way that he's responding in this situation, because he should be the utmost remorseful. You have a young lady who didn't have anything to do with it, who's blaming herself, and he is acting like what he did wasn't a big deal. Grandma raised her eyebrows as if she wasn't in the least bit surprised by my stepfather's faulty wiring. For a moment, it looked as if she might say as much out loud. Instead, she closed her eyes, shrugged her narrow shoulders, and shook her head. When she opened her eyes, she looked disgusted, as if pleading for Lane to just stop talking, but he wasn't ready to give up the floor. Micah's foot touched one of the exposed wires while he was crawling through the fence. He was wet from swimming, so 220 volts just shot right through him, and that made the electricity run through the whole fence. The casual tone in which he described endangering his family by leaving live wires all over his property was almost too much to stomach. I watched Matt's face turn from white to crimson, and the pimples on his chin flush a deep violet. He inched his body closer to the edge of the couch. It seems like if you had done something about those wires sooner, buried them deeper into the ground, this could have been avoided, don't you think? Wait a minute now. Lane straightened his back and cocked his head forward. I don't think it's right to start pointing fingers at anybody here. You've been making lots of money in the States, and you could have done something to fix that place up. Are you freaking kidding me? It's not his job. And he was already sending his mother money. And he was already helping take care of his mother. And he was already supplying them with clothing and bringing presents and stuff like that. And Irene did a whole bunch of stuff around the property. What are you good for? Lane. Matt shot back. I didn't even know the wires were under the damn fence, and I sure as hell didn't know they were taped together. Hey, Lane raised his palms as if to indicate the subject was closed. Did you ever think that maybe our Heavenly Father knows what he's doing? He's the one who chose this time to take your mom and your brothers, not me. Now, do I understand why he did that? Lane shrugged again. Well, of course not. God didn't put those wires there. You did, you miserable son of a bitch. Oh. I felt the words form in my mouth, but the air necessary to speak them caught in my throat when I remembered that a more pressing issue needed resolution, one that Lane's anger would only further complicate. Okay, so she didn't say it out loud. She said it in her head. I think the children should come stay with me for the rest of the summer, Grandma said. It would give them a break, and it's perfect timing. They're on summer vacation. Lane gave her a smug look and snorted. They can come back when school starts. He stared at the floor, indulging her. Besides, I don't think it would be a good idea for anyone to move back into that old house, do you? Lane ran his dirt-filled fingernails through his greasy hair and pretended to think hard about her proposal. Well, it seems to me like there are plenty of people here in LeBaron to take care of Kathy's kids. They can stay with one of my wives for now. Lane, I have a 3-bedroom house all to myself. There's plenty of room for everyone, and the kids can keep me company. He rested his chin in his palm, and wrapped the other arm around his stomach. Look, Thanks for the offer, but there's no way I'm letting all of these kids go back to the States with you. He looked her straight in the eye. I don't trust you bringing them back to LeBaron, and I don't want my kids being raised there away from all my beliefs and what I want them to learn in life. Lane, what exactly do you want them to learn in life? I hope you don't want them to learn the things that you've learned or to do the things that you've done, because you're not the finest example of what a man should be. He moved his hand onto his hip, and I know Kathy wouldn't have wanted that for the kids either. Grandma gave him a look of anger, such as I'd never seen. It was as if all the big and small stupidities she'd put up with for over the years in the name of my father's religion, all the injustices that she'd seen perpetrated against innocent children, all the starvation and suffering and now death, all of it was boiling over in her head, but she held her tongue. Elena got up from the floor and crawled into Grandma's lap, rested her head against the old woman's neck, and wrapped her arms around her. Grandma ran her fingers through the strands of the child's long hair, their lengthy fingernails getting stuck in Elena's tangles. Do you think Mommy will ever come back home? Elena asked. Warm tears streamed down my face as I thought of the years ahead. My head felt so heavy I had to bury my face in my hands and prop my elbows on my knees. Leah stood up and looked at me fearfully, her eyes beginning to water too. I wiped my cheeks and adjusted Holly to make room for Leah on my lap. I took in a deep breath, lowered my head between theirs, and cried as softly as I could. At long last, we arrived at a compromise, though not exactly a happy one. Lane decided that the children could take turns visiting their grandmother, one at a time. It's just the need for him to still control everything. Because all that driving back and forth, separating the kids from one another when they need each other right now, just so he can still have control. Aaron would be first, Luke second, and me and the girls third. As for Matt, later that night, he confided that he and Maria would elope over the weekend. Maria was just 17, so the whole thing needed to be kept a secret. Please, Matt, I said, crying. Take me and the girls with you. We can't, Ruthie. Lane will never let us take the girls. Sit tight. We'll figure something out. But I don't even have money for diapers or baby formula, I said in desperation. What am I supposed to do? Don't look at me. I used every last dollar to pay for the whole funeral. You see what I'm saying? Lane's sitting there and talking about how Matt made all this money and how Matt should have taken care of his mom and did this and did that. Yet he didn't have the money to bury his own children or his wife. Matt did it. Her oldest son. His frustration gave way to an idea. But don't worry. Just charge anything you need at Maudie's store. When I get paid again, I'll wire the money to pay the bill. Matt, please don't leave us here with him. I don't have any choice, Ruthie. If anything happens, call me. I'll get here as fast as I can. Early the next morning, Aaron threw his bag of clothes and collection of He-Man action figures into the back of Matt's truck. Just 10 years old, he had to duck to get inside the short camper shell. He slammed the glass door closed and sat with his back propped up straight on a pillow against the cab, facing us as we stood to watch him leave. Aaron looked away for a moment and tried to appear casual as if he leafed through a comic book. But when the motor started, he looked up again, raised his hand, and slowly waved. His lips began to quiver, and his tan cheeks turned bright red. Soon he was crying, his head growing smaller and smaller as the truck kicked up dust on the road. A few hours later, Lane announced that he was going away for work and taking Luke with him. The rest of us would stay with Alejandra and her family, who were themselves staying with her parents in casas, as there was still no electricity at their house. Lane dropped us off at the same 3-bedroom adobe home we visited with Mom just a few days earlier, back when my biggest worry was candy in a piñata. Ooh, that's how that chapter ended. I'm gonna stop right there. I gotta blow my nose. This was a lot. I'm gonna have to put a warning on this. I just feel like Lane continues to be a piece of trash human. And I'm over him. I'm over him. You all let me know what you thought about this chapter. Like the video as it helps me in these YouTube streets. Thank you guys so much for your time. Have a great Monday.